What's going on, you guys? I wanted to talk to you today about the best ways to set up terrain for Star Wars Legion if you are really not sure how to take the approach with terrain. I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about why it impacts your deployment, why your deployments can influence how you set up terrain, different approaches for setting up terrain, and just some general ideas regarding that. So first off, you want to use about a quarter of the board for filling up pieces of terrain. And so if you're not sure if you got a whole bunch of terrain, you can kind of just stack it all up, and it should take about 25% of your board, give or take. That's just a rough guideline, but there's different ways that you can set it up. First off, if it's a casual game, you can totally just set it up in any which way. Your opponent needs to agree to it, though. You can't just put all the terrain on one side hoping that you get to deploy on that side. Because keep in mind, you are going to set up terrain before you pull out all the cards and do your conditioned deployment and objective cards. So the terrain has to be done completely blind, completely in advance. So in that respect, it's a good idea for you and your opponent both to agree on how the terrain is. Also, you want to talk about what the terrain is going to do, what pieces provide cover, what pieces provide heavy or light cover if they do provide cover, what units are going to, what pieces are tall enough to provide cover to which units. Is this piece too tall or too small to provide cover to, maybe a vehicle, etc. So if there's a river, like I have one piece I have is a river, and it's it's on the Hoth terrain, so we would just need to say, all right, is that impassable terrain? Can only flying vehicles fly over top of it? Or is it a frozen river that maybe my troops can cross? Is it difficult terrain, reducing my movement speed by 1 to a minimum of 1? So you need to talk about all of these things. But when you're placing the terrain, you both have to agree on where everything is placed. One general guideline I always try to tell people is make sure there's at least distance 1 in between each piece, or at least most pieces. Sometimes you'll put 2 barricades right next to each other. That's generally okay, but you wouldn't want all the barricades right next to each other, because there's certain vehicles that need to be able to pass through that stuff, right? You want to make sure, for example, your Snowspeeder and ATST have enough room to actually be able to maneuver. You don't want it to be a negative play experience. You want to have fun. And yes, it's realistic that there might be some worlds where an ATST can't maneuver. Well, then you don't play on those worlds. Play on worlds where everybody has, at least a reasonable chance of having a good time. That being said, distance 1 is a good idea. But there's different ways to set up. So if you're just setting up a casual game and you and your opponent both agree on where everything is, that's fine. If you're not quite you want to take a little bit more competitively, you can do alternating terrain placement. Basically, as long as every piece is roughly about the same size, or if you have some big pieces and some small pieces, have an even number of each, and you and your opponent go back and forth placing one, then your opponent places one, and you go back and forth, so on and so forth. Pretty straightforward that way, and that's fair. There's not much you can say about that. That's fair. But for tournaments, a TO is going to set up all the terrain for you, so you won't really have a say in that. It'll be a third party, somebody completely impartial. Will have all the tables set up ahead of time, and and that's generally about as fair as you can get. But that being said, if you're setting up your own terrain, I want to take a look at these different deployment cards so you can see where you're going to be setting up. So first off is battle lines. This one is just like Star Wars Armada, right? You're setting up 6 inches from your side of the edge. Your opponent's setting up 6 inches from their side of the edge. So it's wide open. This is pretty dangerous because usually terrain here, this is great if terrain is spaced out kind of evenly. Major offensive is, a very interesting one. You're starting off in the different corners. This one is a very interesting way to take advantage of terrain. You're kind of hoping there's terrain in the middle, so to kind of block certain shots. Especially if your opponent has, an ATST with a long range, maybe the mortar launcher, or your DLT-19 stormtroopers, things like that. You don't want to necessarily be open to getting shot on the first turn. Disarray is an interesting one because disarray is completely bonkers. And you have to put one on each side. So disarray is the most interesting, I think, out of all of the terrain placements, or at least the starting deployments, because terrain can potentially have no effect, especially on the far left and far right side. You probably don't want to deploy your guys too far all the way close to the edge here if you can help it, just because there's not likely to be terrain all the way touching the very, very sides of the map. But that is something you might want to consider in case you're planning to push for this card if if you really want this type of deployment. And then also we have the Long March, which is just playing long ways of the board, pretty standard here. Very similar to our first one. You've got you can still shoot kind of straight at each other. There's no angles, so you're looking at a lot of straight lines here. And then also coming, with the terrain expansion, or these there's going to be another deployment, and it's advanced positions, and then this one is kind of interesting. But the thing that's most interesting about all of these is that there are certain places that are uniform for just about all of them. Now that we've gotten through all of these, what's important is these corners, because all the deployments have corners. They all involve corners, and with the exception of disarray, this is what you are all going to see in every single one of them. So from distance 1 up and distance 3 across is covered in every single one except for disarray, although disarray does still have that. So if you look here, it's there. If you look here, it's there. We have 3. Certainly 1 is there. Here, it's flip-flopped. So if you're building terrain, you want it to be fair, because you never know which side you're going to end up in, which corner, where you're going to end up. Here it's 3 and beyond, and then here you also have that 1, and of course in 3. So in every card, this is the one area that's consistent. And the same thing for the other side. So those 2 corners are going to be present, are going to be in use in every single deployment. Now, that being said, that's important on how you set up terrain. Because you might go up against somebody who, and again, if you're setting up terrain, in theory, you don't really know the build of what your opponent's going to, so you can't be like, oh, well, you have all really close range stuff, so we're going to make it nice and wide open so I can shoot you before you get to me, stuff like that. Maybe somebody's running fleet troopers, and like, oh, well, they're really dangerous at range 2, but I'm going to take my DLT-19 stormtroopers, so I want to specifically set up wide open terrain and not have anything. So you don't know that, and you don't usually want wide open terrain. You want to be able to move from piece to piece. You want some protection in case your opponent has long range stuff. So one of the things I generally, you can deploy wherever you want, but you're always going to have this. So if you do, after everything is said and done, you realize, wow, my opponent has a tremendous advantage on me. They might be able to take out Luke Skywalker right away, or something like that, with long range stuff. You can always consider deploying pieces here. Because what this is going to do, this is going to at least give you some, you're going to be able to deploy in this corner. You're going to be able to potentially, if you have terrain where the green parts are, you'll be able to put somebody kind of behind there and get them some cover if they need it, or if they need to move around stuff and try to move towards objectives, or things like that. So it's also important that you don't put all of your terrain inside the square, because some of the objectives are going to want to have you marking pieces of terrain that are not in a deployment zone. And so sometimes having terrain in a deployment zone is a bad thing. You kind of want to make sure your terrain is just out of your deployment zone, but that you're able to use it. If you need to climb, you don't want it too far away. You want to be able to move and then clamber up, or just move or move and then get ready to do a full climb next turn. But considering that disarray is there, it's not necessarily a bad idea to put some on the other corners as well. Just because this way, and always try and make it symmetrical, just in case you end up having to have stuff in multiple corners. Something like this might be a good starting option. You're kind of covering all the different bases. So depending, and if you've got these in the 4 corners, just about wherever you go, you're going to have some places that you can hide, some places your opponent can hide. It'll be a kind of a balanced game. And then as I go a little bit further, beyond that, I generally like to put, a big piece in the middle, maybe a big piece on the left and right side, and generally just make it symmetrical. And then also the little dots are just like scatter terrain, things like your barricades. If you make your own terrain or whatever. One of the problems I had, like when I first started playing, I was using all the big terrain pieces that I had made, and the problem is sometimes that leaves you a little bit open, because you do need smaller things to hide behind too. Because again, if you're leaving distance 1 between as many pieces as you can, and you're trying to leave routes for big vehicles and larger troop movements to be able to go, you want to make sure that you also aren't doing that at the cost of your troops not having anything to hide behind. So basically, something like this is just a kind of a one example that is probably going to cover you for just about any type of deployment. So whether you end up getting this, you end up getting this, you end up getting this, or you end up getting this, or even that, the idea is you're going to have plenty of places to hide behind, or if you want to start out in the open, maybe I start out with my ATST with mortar launchers and I want to start them out in the open. Let me go back to the final setup. I can potentially, put somebody in such a way that they are going to have big avenues, because at the same time, while there are pieces here, there's also lanes. You want to have some lanes. They don't have to be completely across the entire board. You don't necessarily have to have a lane of free shooting that goes too far, but you do want to have some lanes, especially depending on if you're placing objectives or not. You might want to place an objective wide out in the open in a lane, just so this way you can cover it in case the opponent comes for it. Or, you might want to place an objective behind a piece of terrain that's close enough to you so you can get it and take it in safety. So these are all different things you want to think about when you're placing terrain. This is kind of just a rough example on how I tend to do stuff. And these big pieces don't necessarily have to be buildings. They could be like tree emplacements. They could be rocks. They could be buildings. They could be crashed ships or whatever. Anything that's about, like the size of a softball or bigger is going to qualify as one of the bigger pieces, and anything kind of small like a single tree or a barricade or a crate or just a small rocks or whatever, and those are like the little dots. Just a rough idea. That's kind of how I do it, but you guys can do it however you want. There is another round of the giveaway going on right now, so if you would like to enter to win an expansion of your choice in the form of a $20 Cool Stuff gift card, all you have to do is subscribe and leave a comment on this or one of my videos. It's as simple as that, and you can enter to win that. So I thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Also, we got Crabbok.com going. I've got a lot of information there. I put a lot of guides up on there. So there's errata too, when there's new FAQs and things like that come out. So I try to keep that updated. So put some of your screenshots too on my Discord. If you're painting your stuff, I'm going to try to feature and showcase all of your guys' artwork. So definitely do that, and you can drop them on Discord. A lot of people have done that already, so you can go see what's on there as well. And Discord's pretty cool. If you're not familiar with it, it runs in a web browser, and it's kind of like a multiple chat rooms, and you can upload screenshots. It's almost like having message boards, and it stays persistent, so you can just pop in once in a while or just hang out in there if you want. There's even voice chat, so if you're playing video games or Battlefront or whatever you want, just do whatever you want. It's a pretty cool thing, though. I like it, and I have it up there for you guys. So I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and have a great day.